I've been looking forward to this interview for, well, a long, long time. Judith Curry, Dr. Judith Curry, climate scientist. And I love to list this off as I did at the outset of the show. I mean, we're talking the author of, 180 peer-reviewed article, a former chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, Georgia Institute of Technology. The list is just too long, and I did it right at the top of the show, so I'm not going to go into it here, but that's why I've been looking forward to it. Dr. Curry, thanks so much for finding time for us.
Oh, thanks for inviting me, Mike. I look forward to this.
Well, have you ever had a journey? I want to go back to, and just maybe help people understand, in your case, you went to, and this is my word, not yours, a darling of sort of the scientific community. I mean, you were recognized very early with prizes and awards and stuff like that, successful career. And then it seems to me you made the fatal mistake. You questioned the orthodoxy when it comes to climate change.
Well, in a way, it's worse than that. I question things that, are well within the range of uncertainty of the UN climate assessment reports. My cardinal sin was to criticize the behavior of important people in the IPCC. Okay, and this came to a head. You may recall ClimateGate. These were the unauthorized emails.
Let's remind people of what that is. I think it was 2008, 2009, when they...
of 2009, a hacker got into the computers at University of East Anglia and revealed the emails of a whole bunch of IPCC authors. And it revealed all sorts of skullduggery, including trying to evade Freedom of Information Act requests, get journal editors fired, bypass the policies of the IPCC, practices in terms of what could be referenced and all of these kind of things. It was just a bunch of skullduggery, and I said, look, we need to do better. I mean, it was really embarrassing for the whole climate community,
yes.
Caught with their pants down, so to speak. I said, we need to do better. We need to make all of our data publicly available. We need to be transparent about our methods. We need to be more honest about uncertainty and pay more attention to trying to characterize it. And we need to avoid being overconfident in our conclusions. And finally, we need to be respectful of the people who are critical of our work. And if we think they're wrong, we should challenge them with good arguments. We shouldn't insult them or try to get them canceled. So, you would think that, these are motherhood and apple pie kind of things, but oh my gosh. My statements were met with complete silence in the community. Nobody in authority was speaking out other than the people who were caught with their pants down and they were trying to defend themselves. Oh, but the science is fine. And just absolute silence until maybe about 5 months later when the president of the National Academy of Science came out and said essentially what I did, we need to do better. But it's complete silence from the IPCC. And they said, well, what do we do about Judith Curry? That's a real problem. And they were complaining about all the media attention I was getting, this, that, and the other. And things really came to a head. And this is almost a year later, that this would be 2011, maybe, somewhere in there. I wrote a blog post on hiding the decline, criticizing an aspect of the hockey stick, paleoclimate temperature graph, where they had spliced two time series together in a way that I thought was very misleading. And so I said, this is misleading. We shouldn't do this. What were they thinking? Kind of thing. Okay. And that was it, because this involves Michael Mann. And then Michael Mann said, I know what to do with the Judith Curry problem. Let's just call her a denier. She's put her in the, throw her out of the tribe, put her in the group with all the cranks, and then we can completely dismiss her. And, so that was pretty much the end. And great idea. And so everybody joined the fray and calling me well, led by Michael Mann, a climate disinformer, a denier, every sort of bad name that you can think of.
It's interesting to note, contrary to your approach, when you first encountered, let's call them skeptics. I don't like that, just people who have questions and challenge, et cetera. But you engaged with them immediately. And look at
Absolutely.
their response is let's have ad hominem attacks so we don't have to engage. And that to me has been characteristic of the entire climate issue, in that efforts made by name calling, by canceling, by
Okay.
discrediting, a conversation. And that's anti-science to me.
Absolutely. Back in 2006, I began to be fascinated by the climate blogosphere. I mean, realclimate.org, Michael Mann was one of the founders, and they had a whole blog roll of all these other blogs. And I was following that, and I said, oh, wow, this is a wonderful way to communicate. Okay, so in August of 2006, I published a paper, Hurricanes and Global Warming, that got a lot of media attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I said, okay, so I was going around to all the blogs that were talking about my paper. Okay, and I landed on climate audit, and people were asking for my data and talking about the statistical analysis. And I go, whoa, this is pretty interesting. Why have I never heard of this blog before? It's not on the Real Climate blog roll.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I soon realized that the proprietor of the blog was Steve McIntyre, who was the arch enemy of Michael Mann. Okay, and this was where all the criticism, the headquarters for criticizing the hockey stick. And so, I interacted with them for quite a bit and quite regularly, in the comments, debating with them. I wrote a few guest posts, and I thought that was pretty interesting. And the people on the other side, were cheering me on. Oh, Judith Curry is giving them hell over a climate audit, bravo. But I came to understand them and their perspectives and appreciate there are a lot of people on that, participating in that who have very good mathematical and statistical skills. And, far better than mine and far better than Michael Mann's. And so, I was paying good attention to them. So when ClimateGate struck, with these things posted on Climate Audit, I was on the phone with Steve McIntyre. We're talking, what do we do? How do we try to calm this down? And that's what motivated me writing these essays, criticizing the IPCC and the behavior of those scientists. So, I mean, that's the near-term history. But they set out to sabotage me. And in many ways, they were successful. If you, back in the day, say around 2013, if you would Google Judith Curry, you would see, the things that show up. Judith Curry, climate denier, climate heretic, Judith Curry turns on her colleagues. You'd see, a whole page of this stuff. And so I was looking for other positions. I wanted to get out of Georgia Tech. They had made things very uncomfortable for me. So headhunters thought I was a great candidate. I went to interview for some big jobs. And at the end of the day, they said, you're a great candidate in many ways, but you're never going to get hired because if you Google Judith Curry and all the stuff shows up, what university administrator is going to hire you? So I saw the writing on the wall and I said, okay, I could have stayed around and sucked up my big salary at Georgia Tech, but that's not who I am. So I resigned and I'm now full-time in the private sector, my own company, Climate Forecast Applications Network.
A couple of things, just very quickly. I mean, hasn't the hockey stick been completely discredited now? I mean, not just now, but I mean, for quite a while.
Okay, okay. The methodology behind it has been largely discredited. There have been teams of paleoclimate scientists getting together to do new reconstructions. And there was this group who put together a more realistic reconstruction. And then this group split into two. Okay. One that was, working to refine the more realistic reconstructions, and the other half that went back to the old hockey stick style of analysis. So the point of it is that there's a huge amount of uncertainty in terms of what the global temperature was back then. We have historical records, we have regional paleoclimate proxies, but in terms of trying to make a statement about what the global temperatures were back then, colossal amount of uncertainty. So, I mean, they were so overconfident of what they were doing back in 1998. Just unbelievable.
But again, that's such a key point, though, because the public has been fed a level of certainty that I don't think is merited by our science, and including the modeling. Oh my gosh, we're acting like modeling's like taking a temperature of somebody in the room with you.
All right, so we can blame this on the politicians.
Yeah.
You know, the policy cart has been way out in front of the scientific horse from the very beginning of all this. I mean, back in 1992, we had an international climate treaty, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, to prevent dangerous anthropogenic warming by eliminating fossil fuel emissions. This was before we had any idea what was going on with the climate, not to mention the socioeconomic consequence of attempting this, on short time horizons. So, the UN put out, frame this as a global problem. We need a global solution. And in order to push this forward, we need a global consensus of scientists. So the IPCC was, mandated to find a consensus about dangerous human-caused climate change. They basically manufactured a consensus on all this, under the direction, request, insistence of their bosses, the UN. So we ended up with this very narrow framing of the problem, completely ignored the role of natural climate variability, assumed that all warming was bad, completely ignoring the impacts, and focusing only on one policy response. So we have this very, very narrow framing of this colossally complex, uncertain, and ambiguous problem, which has brought us to the silliness in this whole issue that we see today.
I would think, though, I want to just reemphasize your point that seems to get overlooked. When they presented the problem, they didn't have the scientific backing, to elaborate, but they only considered one policy solution. To me, that's, so damning, but a lot of people don't understand that it wasn't an either or. We could have had a lot of policy choices, at least to debate, but we weren't debating at that point. We still aren't debating, and I just think you can drive a truck through that. But I want to come back to the IPCC because I don't think people appreciate, and I'm saying, I'm sitting on the outside, but I've read the reports, and the first thing that jumped out is which politician wrote it. Now, that may be a glib way of saying it, but I think people are shocked when they find out that final Let's Take Action report isn't written by scientists. It's written by bureaucrats, who are aligned with the politicians. It's not a scientific document.
Okay. In the Working Group 1 report on the physical basis of climate change, if you go into the bowels of the report, there is some good science. Okay. Not enough, but there is some good science. The summary for policymakers, again, is essentially written by the policymakers, and they cherry pick things. And if you only look since 1970, this has gotten worse. But if they forget to tell you that if you look back to 1930, things were worse then, that kind of cherry picking. And the IPC, even the summary for policymakers is relatively tame. I mean, it's cherry picked, it's slanted, it's spun. But then when you hear the UN officials to talk about it, code red, we're on the highway to hell, existential threat, about these things that, if you really dig into it, it's hard. Is this really all that dangerous? That they're spinning in their statements. And then, of course, this gets amplified by the media. And then what the public consumes is just a bunch of political spin.
And I mean, obviously it's successful. But when I see school children out there, protesting climate change, and I don't think they could go 1 minute with me, but that's how I feel about most politicians. I could give me 1 minute, I'll undress them. But they know so little about it. And there's so many big issues that you can drive a truck through. And I think their lack of sophistication, just so you know, I talk about this all the time because it brings it down to a level you didn't need any sophistication to know you need backup for renewable energy. That takes nothing but the sun doesn't shine every day. That's all it would have taken. But I think that's representative of their thought process.
Well, no, all this energy stuff, I mean, it's being voted in by politicians.
Yeah.
Say New York now has a mandate, a very aggressive mandate to go to 100% renewable energy on a very short time scale. Okay. New York, I mean, they have some decent hydropower, which helps, but they're aggressively getting rid of not just their coal, not just their gas, but also their nuclear. Okay.
I guess I should say, do they not know where Germany is?
Okay.
Didn't Germany feature that movie first?
I know. Okay. So I sit on a committee of the New York System Reliability Corporation, something like that, to extreme weather events. So we've been putting together some stress test case studies, based on historical data and this, that, and the other about, 17 days when the wind doesn't blow and it's the middle of winter. Where's your solar? I mean, and the temperatures are really, really cold. Now, what are you doing? I'm praying that New Jersey has a lot of nuclear power that they can transmit into New York. It just makes no sense. But I'm on a committee with engineers, and they sort of get it. But the point is, the politicians aren't asking the engineers, what they should be doing. They're just making this political decisions and these mandates, and the engineers have to figure out how to, provide electricity on a reliable basis and keep the frequency. Wind and solar are terrible for intermittency is one thing, but they really screw up the frequency control. Yes. Because they're asynchronous, and they need to add all sorts of asynchronous converters, and you need to add all this stuff to it, and it gets really, really expensive to do. And nobody has demonstrated that you can do 100%, wind and solar based electricity system. Places like Iceland and Costa Rica, they have lots of hydropower and geothermal. Okay, that's how they can be 100% renewable. But in the absence of those kind of resources, wind and solar are not going to cut it. So, I mean, and South Australia is farthest along of anybody in terms of trying to do this. And I've been following closely as to what they're doing. There's a number of articles on my blog, Climate Etc., JudithCurry.com, by transmission engineers and a grid operator from New Zealand who's been writing the articles on my blog about how and why this isn't working. So, I mean, it's a political decision. It's misguided in so many ways, and it's introducing so many risks, not just to, I mean, our whole society depends on electricity, everything that we do. Okay, and this is, if we're adding instability and higher costs into our electric utility system, we're damaging our economy, we're reducing our vulnerability, we're increasing our vulnerability to extreme weather events and so on and so forth. I mean, for what? In a futile attempt to slow down the slow creep of global warming. It just makes absolutely no sense.
Well, I'm sitting here in Canada right now. We contribute apparently about 1.6% to 1.5% of global emissions. And we have canceled really tens of billions of dollars in fossil fuel projects, natural gas and oil. And my question always is, what do we get in return? Because it sure as hell didn't impact the climate. And what's a bit embarrassing for the government is the current finance minister, deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, made it clear in an interview with the Financial Times that Canada can't even move the dial. No matter what we do, we can't move the dial. And yet we're prepared to give away tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, jobs, et cetera. The list is a long one. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. I want to come back to the extreme weather events, though, Now, you, as you said, you first became, and again, obviously people knew you in the community, the scientific community, but your hurricane paper that, from what I can understand from my background is, of course, the media cherry picked what you said in that paper. But I want to maybe get a simpler comment on every fire that broke out. And it's a tragedy in some areas, obviously, but it's got to be climate change. Everything is climate change. We've got a flood. It's climate change. We got this. It's climate change. And I mean, it takes 2 seconds to get that explanation into the media.
Okay. Well, it represents, okay, first, even the IPCC acknowledges that there's, very little relationship between a warming temperature and worsening extreme events, apart from heat waves,
Yeah.
floods, droughts, hurricanes, all this other stuff. There's not much there. And on the benefit side of it, we're getting fewer extreme cold events. And there's 9 times greater mortality from cold events than from heat events. I mean, this is varied.
Yeah.
The good news is that overall mortality is lessened in a warmer climate. Where have you heard that? Well, you haven't probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, again, I'm in Canada. We wouldn't mind a little more warm weather throughout the year.
And this is the thing about winners and losers. I mean, Canada, Siberia, northern China. I mean, they would certainly benefit from warmer temperatures. It would increase agricultural productivity, etc. I mean, in the US, people like they hate warm winters, okay? So they're leaving Illinois and New York and they're moving to Texas, Florida, and Arizona, which are southern warm states. But this whole issue about politicians blaming the Maui fires or the Libyan floods or the floods in New York City. These are some recent ones. Oh, it's climate change. They throw up their hands and they can't do anything. Well, it's an out. It's a sleazy, cheap out where they can deflect the blame for their bad decisions in terms of land use policy, infrastructure, emergency management, warnings, et cetera, on climate change. And the only thing we can do is stop burning fossil fuels. So it's just a convenient out for poor governance and poor decision making.
Let me come to, here's the problem for individuals, and people who aren't versed in necessarily immersed in the science, et cetera. Where do we get good information? Because yeah, sir. Okay, yes. You're laughing because that's impossible. But I mean, I know, by simply doing the work. I read what the media says is what in the latest IPCC report. I don't have to look very far to say, wait a second, it didn't actually say that. Or wait a second, you've missed a very important conclusion here. Because it's a pure agenda getting pushed. I don't think there's much debate on that. So I'm just wondering, and again, we could probably talk hours on this particular thing, but if you can give me a quick snapshot of what do we do as individuals?
Okay, the Working Group 1 report from the IPCC, forget the summary for policymakers, there is some good information in there. Okay, it's a starting point. In terms of reliable information, allow me to make a plug for my own information sources.
Yeah.
I have a blog, Climate Etc., judithcurry.com, where we discuss a whole range of climate relevant issues, fundamental science, the energy transition. I have a great group of people who contribute posts. I mentioned the previous ones, about the electricity grid and things like that, and also about policy and politics and adaptation and a whole range of things like that. And so open it up for discussion. And my blog is probably the only one out there on this topic where people from both sides of the debate show up to shout it out. I try to keep the insult, I moderate to remove insults, but there's a real debate. There was an incredible one a couple of weeks ago by a Greek hydrologist, Dimitris Koutsianos, who was talking about the carbon dioxide budget and the uncertainties and the way he was reasoning about it, which is quite contrary to what you normally see. And I think this has almost 600 comments. We have all sorts of scientists and other
Mm-hmm.
interested people with technical background discussing, challenging, and Demetrius is there responding to all these questions.
Yeah.
And you can't find that anywhere else, okay, on the blog. The other thing, if you're just starting out, I mean, there are a few good books out there. First, I have to plug my own Climate Uncertainty and Risk, Rethinking Our Response. It integrates, the politics and social psychology of what's going on with an understanding of climate models and what we might expect in the 21st century. And the third part has a deep foundation in risk science, which goes into how badly we've mischaracterized risk, how we should go about doing it, and how we should, manage it. A couple of other books out there I can recommend: Unsettled
Yeah.
by Stephen Koonin, and False Alarm by Bjorn Lomborg. I mean, those are two recent books that I can recommend. I mean, between my book, Koonin's, and Lomborg's book, we cover, the full spectrum of, I think, the relevant territory. So I can recommend those books.
Well, I can recommend Climate Uncertainty and Risk, Rethinking Our Response. The other thing I really enjoyed about the book, let me just say, I'm the type of person, okay, where's your source? How did you get that? Where does it come from? And my goodness, is that well supported through footnotes? When I read the footnotes or something that I'm not aware of, and I just want to go, okay, so give me more. Oh, the book is brilliant at giving me more. So you've got a nice read of 230 pages or something, and you get the footnotes. So I want to plug that because I think this is what's missing. It's
1,500
expertise.
footnotes, which
Really?
direct you to a range of sources. Yeah. Someone told me it was taking him forever to get through my book because he was zinging, through all the footnotes on each chapter. Oh, wow, I didn't know that. So.
No, that's what I enjoyed. The other thing, I forgive me, I should have said this up front to make sure people are clear. You're not saying there's not climate change or there's not man influenced on climate. I want to make sure that that's they say those things, not just about you, but about someone else. The whole denier label is so they don't have to discuss it. So we said, or things like there's a 97% consensus of scientists, really, really, it's just such nonsense.
Okay. Here's what we know, the facts that nobody disagrees on.
Yeah.
Global temperature has increased overall since about 1860. Humans emit CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. CO2 and these other greenhouse gases have an infrared emission spectra and act to warm the planet. Nobody questions any of those things. However, those three facts don't tell us anything about the most consequential issues. These include how much of the recent warming is caused by humans versus natural variability, how will climate change in the 21st century, and whether human-caused warming is dangerous. I mean, there's widespread disagreement and uncertainty on those factors. And then, of course, the relevant policy issue, the issue as to whether this rapid transition away from fossil fuels and toward wind and solar energy is overall going to make us better off or worse off, both now and in the future. And it's pretty clear it's going to make us worse off, which is a case that I make in the risk assessment part of my book.
Yeah. Let me just, by the way, you may have caught it, but there is a recent paper out of Statistics Norway, and Canadians will understand we have Statistics Canada. And their question was, to what extent are temperature levels changing due to greenhouse gas emissions? But here's the conclusion. The results imply that the effect of man-made CO2 emissions does not appear to be sufficiently strong to cause systematic changes in the pattern of the temperature fluctuation. In other words, our analysis indicates that with the current level of knowledge, it seems impossible to determine how much of the temperature increase is due to emissions of CO2. Well, that's a pretty startling conclusion. But again, my point is, it's not in the public. I just want to talk about it. I'm not pretending to have the scientific background to say yay or nay to that, but
Yeah.
it's not
Well,
discussed.
I glanced at that paper. I saw it mentioned on Twitter. My
Mhm.
understanding they were focused on looking at the temperature data in Norway rather
Yeah.
than global
Sorry. Yes.
temperature. And the interesting thing about it is these are statisticians. They certainly know how to deal with data, but they don't have any skin in the game in terms of the climate debate. So they don't come into it with preconceived notions or I have to do it this
Yes.
way in order, so they had no skin in the game. So they can, just call it like they see it. And I thought,
Mhm.
oh, I love this.
Well, what an advantage. I remember when you published a public letter when you resigned. And I just thought it was so telling. You're talking about research and other professional activities are professionally rewarded only if they are channeled in certain directions approved by a politicized academic establishment. And this is one of the other challenges that funding. I mean, there's tons of people who disagree with aspects. I'm talking, sorry, not tons of people, scientists who
Mhm.
disagree with many aspects or some aspects of the whole sort of, let's call it climate agenda or
Mhm.
the narrative that we're getting fed, but they don't dare speak out because, I mean, good luck getting a funding paper, your paper or your research
Well,
funded.
I mean, the whole academic ecosystem is just, promoting this issue. I mean, the professional societies are advocates for this. These are the people who publish the journals,
Mm-hmm.
and their editors or gatekeepers. I mean, they don't even send contrary papers out for review. They just go, nope, sorry,
Wow.
not interested. Um, the external recognition from professional science, who gets societies, who gets the big awards, um, who gets the big funding, awards, publication and prestige journals. This is what gets you promotions at the university, gets you big salaries at the university, attracts donor funding for big institutes at the universities. So, the universities have figured out, what side of
Yeah.
the bread there, is the butter on. So, I
Well,
mean, there you have it. You have this whole um, complex academic, you know, political, economic, university, industrial complex surrounding this whole issue, with reinforcing each other, not to mention the media. So there you have it. This is a big
oh, yeah.
juggernaut, the big
Well,
juggernaut.
and there's many reasons, but one is there's an agenda about that global control of people that we also saw in COVID. Uh, uh, and again, I'm not saying yes or no to any aspect, but I know that we weren't allowed to ask questions. It wasn't invited. It wasn't the scientific, public discussion. We've heard from many, many medical people, medical scientists, echoing that same sentiment. But that's why I think it's incumbent upon people to educate themselves. And that's why I want to give another shout out to the book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, Rethinking Our Response. And I'm just sitting here laughing, thinking about, I think PG O'Rourke had a great line about that. He was looking at a protest of young people, very vehement climate change advocates. And he says, they're prepared to do anything to save the planet except read a book. So in that case, I think we have to sit there and own some responsibility and do some reading on our part. You've certainly done your part to educate the public. And I just want to say thank you so much for finding time for us. And I'll put you on the spot because it's always embarrassing if you say no, while we're here broadcasting that I got to get back. There's so many other aspects I want to talk to you about. It's obviously a monstrous size subject and you handle it so beautifully. So I'll put you on the spot and say, let's visit again in the near future.
Oh, I'd be delighted to.
Great stuff. Thank you, Judith, for finding time.
Okay, thank you.